Welcome to Catalyzing Learning at Scale, a session in the Future of Learning track for Global Skills Day 21. I'm Gary Bowles. I'm the host of Global Skills Day, and if this was a physical event, you can kind of picture me scurrying from the main session room out to one of the breakout rooms for the Future of Learning. So I'm really excited about this particular session because I feel that the work that my guests are doing is so inspirational. My hope that you will understand the way that each of these organizations are trying to accomplish really big goals and the ways that they've learned how to partner with each other, and especially their insights about what works, the ways that they've found that they can actually help people to be able to learn at scale, and then also maybe one or two insights about the things that don't work so that we won't necessarily replicate some of the errors or some of the challenges that have been difficult to overcome. So I want to first welcome my guests, and then I'm going to ask them each to briefly introduce themselves and their organizations. And then I want to dive into a series of questions about how they partner together, some of the populations that they're working to help, and some of the insights that they've gained. So first, I want to thank Mona Morshed for joining us. She's the CEO of Generation, often labeled Generation You Employed, former leader at McKinsey, and an amazing catalyst for initiatives around the world. I just see Rashni Singh just joined us. She's with the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa. Michael Fung, who's with Singapore Skills Future. Michael, it's so great to see you. And then also, I think we're going to be joined by Sharmi Surnarain, and she's with the Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator in Kenya. So we've got a global group here spanning the globe. So what I'd love to do is I'd love to start off with Mona and just ask you just to help people understand a little bit about your organization and your focus, and then I'm going to ask Michael to do the same.
Thanks, Gary, and thank you for the opportunity to bring together all of these individuals. So Generation is a global employment nonprofit. And so what we do is recruit, train, and place learners into careers that would otherwise be beyond their reach. So we began our work about 6.5 years ago. We've now supported 45,000 learners across 14 countries and growing. We're probably going to add another 3 this year. And we have an 83% job placement rate within 3 months of program completion. And at 1 year, about 70% of our learners continue to be employed. And so we have a 7-step process, which I'm happy to describe later in the session, but essentially it begins with finding the jobs. And we currently work across 30 professions, having a boot camp that is 4 to 12 weeks long and profession specific. And then we place our graduates in jobs, and then we track the return on investment thereafter. And so we have learned, Gary, lots of things that worked and lots of things that haven't, and very happy to share. And I'm delighted to also be in this panel with Michael, because we've had a tremendous partnership in Singapore that has taught us a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mona. So Michael, please give people a little bit about your breathtaking range of your focus. And I'm sure we could be able to dive into a variety of learnings that you've had through the session as well.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Mona. It's a real pleasure to be here to engage in conversation on a topic that's really important. Let me just give a quick introduction to Skills Future Singapore, the organization I'm with. We are an agency under the Ministry of Education, and our focus has been on workforce skills development and building a culture of lifelong learning across the population. And we do that through a range of partnerships with private sector, with nonprofit organizations, with other government agencies, and with the unions, industry bodies, and so on. We serve all population segments, and we serve all companies and workers across the various industry sectors here in Singapore. And I've been working across multiple stakeholders and partners to bring about an integrated education and training system. As Lindsay had, she made some remarks about the broken system. What we are really seeing is the fragmentation between the formal education system and the learning opportunities after that. That gap has to be bridged. And so that's what we've been attempting to build in Singapore, so that the system is flexible and is able to adapt to changes, and it's integrated throughout life. And this has proven to be very helpful in terms of responding to disruptions. I can share a little bit more about that later on in the conversation. But as we saw during the pandemic last year, we were able to leverage on the system we built to switch displaced workers into different jobs, and also to respond to fast changing disruptions like technology, advent of AI, and so on. So I'll just pause right there and we can have a longer conversation later on. Thank you.
No, thanks, Michael. That's awesome. So, Rashni, I want you to give people an understanding of what the focus of DT&I and your work is. I do want to say, I mean, there's challenges all around the world, but especially I know in South Africa, there's some really profound challenges nowadays that we in America have been experiencing ourselves. And so I just hope you and yours are well, and that you'll be able to move past those challenges as rapidly as possible.
A very warm South African greeting to you all. Things have settled down here quite a bit this week. So thankfully, it's now, the focus is on cleaning up and recovery. So thankfully we were able to get out of the situation fairly quickly. It lasted just a week, and we on our way to trying to recover. But my name obviously is Rashni Singh, and I'm the director responsible for global business services at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition in South Africa. We're a national government department that actually focuses on policy advocacy, as well as, for each of the priority sectors, there's what we used to call a customized sector program. And recently we've started with what we call a master plan for all the key priority sectors of government. The global business services sector obviously is focused on IT-enabled services, and encompassing a lot of what I think everybody would know as business process outsourcing, and a bit of shared services and various other IT-enabled services. What we have, this sector has been prioritized since 2006, and there's been a number of initiatives and learnings over the years in terms of how do we match demand and supply from a skills perspective. So I'm really delighted to be here with you this evening, and I'm really looking forward to share some of the experiences and lessons that we've learned over the years. So thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you with us. And then Sharmi, it's wonderful to have you here. Just asking briefly to describe your role, describe your organization, and then I've got a series of questions for all of you.
Thanks, Gary. So my name is Sharmi Suryanarayan. I'm the Chief Impact Officer for Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, and a close partner of Rashni's and the South African government's. Harambee was started about 10 years ago, and we have since our inception been really focused on addressing the supply-demand mismatch between young people coming into the labor market and the lack of jobs pretty much in South Africa. And as Rashni mentioned, this past week has been quite intense for South Africa. As some of you may have seen in the news, unemployment is a huge issue in South Africa and globally, but we have been focused very much on addressing the supply-demand mismatch, both by focusing on creating new jobs, as well as skilling young people for jobs that are coming up in the labor market. And Harambee has, since its inception, pathwayed more than 500,000 young people to jobs and work experiences through its pathway management platform. And we are really, really keen to understand from both global innovation, but really importantly, understanding what the cutting edge is in terms of looking at what skilling looks like for the future of work for young people in terms of getting into the labor market and addressing the barriers that confront them So we have about 1.4 million young people on our platform through SAYouth.mobi, which is our platform that we have implemented through our partnerships through the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. And we are very excited to learn from many partners in this space, in the ecosystem, through the DTIC, such as Rachni and many others in the space. But we are very excited to learn from many others, such as Generation. And yeah, we are here to change the system, not just for the young person, but for the system as a whole. So excited to be here.
No, absolutely. I think this is our collective challenge and opportunity, is that we're trying to basically hit the problem at a series of different levels. We need to change it systemically, but we also need to change on the ground. So since you mentioned the job mismatch, Mona, I was going to just ask you, you've talked about the methodology that Generation follows. Help us to understand, how is it that you can help really large numbers of people to be able to make connections, to get the training that they need and make connections to work? And 83% is a tremendous, even 70% is a tremendous success rate, because many of these programs, the history in the United States of these kinds of programs of trying to match people up, I remember going back into the 1970s, where as miserable as maybe 15% of people would actually get real jobs afterwards. So help us understand that approach. And then Michael, I wanted to ask you, in Singapore, then, because you've got such a range of populations, so sort of how you think about the connective tissue that's necessary to be able to help that to continue to happen on an ongoing basis. So Mona, please help us understand the methodology.
Absolutely. So when we created our 7-step methodology, it was very much with what you just said in mind, Gary, right? So we looked at many different employment programs across the world. And what we saw is that those that train and place learners into jobs typically operate at a much smaller volume, but have high employment rates. And then those that are training hundreds of thousands, if not more, on an annual basis, tend to have a significantly lower employment rate, right? And so our question was, well, how can you be somewhere in the middle of that, right? So how can you deliver a high employment rate and at the same time be able to reach tens of thousands on an annual basis? In the workforce space, there are a lot of different fragments, right? So there is a fragment that does training. There is a fragment that does mentorship. There is a fragment that does job matching. And so what we are trying to do with this methodology is bring it all together holistically and in an integrated way to, in particular, support the learners who are facing the greatest systemic barriers. And so in order for them to be able to get to these opportunities, you have to be able to put all the puzzle pieces together. And so that's why we begin with pre-confirming the job vacancies. Then we recruit our learners, and we're always looking for learners who are different than what the traditional profile of what the employer would usually hire, because otherwise there's no point in doing this. Then the boot camp. The boot camp is activity specific. And so it's activity first, then skills, which might seem like a nuance, but we're very focused on what are the activities that you have to do in this role that really distinguishes someone from being a high performer from being an average performer. And then it's that deep understanding of those activities that, first of all, lets us shorten the amount of training time required, but also lets us then link those things to productivity outcomes, to quality outcomes, to look at each activity and understand what are the technical skills you need, what are the behavioral skills, what are the mindsets, and to sew it together in a way that's fully practice-based so that the learner has the greatest chance of learning what he or she needs to know at a very rapid pace. In parallel, we have social support services, and then our graduates interview with our employer partners. And then, as I mentioned, we start tracking the return on investment. So it's the knitting together of all of these pieces is what enables us to make this work. And there's still, just to be clear, there's still much, much more we need to be able to get right. But this is, that's what we've now seen across all 14 countries, across all 30 professions. We use the same method.
So no, I think you've hit on some key points, and I'm going to actually leap in just a second. Sharmi, you're nodding so much. I want to make sure we're hearing your insights, Sharmi, because it sounds like these all resonate with you. But I want to make sure we're just calling out to the listeners. These are very important. having job demand at the end is critical, because if you're just training people, you're just increasing supply, but there's no connection to real work. Helping to ensure that there are alternative profiles for people, because if it's the same people that would have gotten jobs anyway, then that's you haven't hacked the system at all. But also agency. I hear, Mona, sort of the thread through is that you're helping to be able to train and develop agency by the worker, so that they have, this North Star, the Southern Cross, this guide, of the work that they want to do, that enables them to be able to connect the future work more effectively. So Sharmi, you're nodding. I want to understand why and what parts of this resonate with you. And then Michael, I want to ask you sort of the broader connective tissue in Singapore.
So absolutely, Gary. I mean, everything Mona says resonates so deeply, because I think with Harambee, it's been about demand first, right? So I think we've seen that training alone, especially in the global South, isn't enough. So we've seen young people get, innumerable skills, certifications, and training qualifications, but it hasn't been enough. So for many reasons, because we've seen that young people both have the skills, the qualifications, but the jobs aren't being generated. And so everything that Mona said resonates deeply, because in many cases, we don't have the number of jobs, absorb the number of young people, however skilled they might be, that enter the labor market. So as Harambee, we've seen over the past 10 years that it's less about the skills and the qualifications, and it's more about what signals and what barriers can they overcome, young people, to actually have line of sight to the job and immediately address the barriers and address and actually access a job. And I think Rashni, will be able to share that, see that, addressing barriers to access to jobs at the entry level is much more important than getting young people skilled, whether it's in digital jobs or in many other kinds of spaces, because we've seen that, it doesn't matter if you have a high school degree or even a college degree, that the barriers to access to jobs is much more about who you know and the networks and perhaps, sort of credentials that the jobs might impose versus what qualifications actually make a difference in the job. So at Harambee, we've been very keen to address the barriers to entry to a job. So whether it's transport, whether it's data access, we've been able.
I think we're losing you a little bit, Sharmi.
To zero rate our Mobi site. So we have a Mobi zero rate. We have made site data free to young people, which is a huge issue for barriers and access to being able to access to the labor market. And we've been able to make that zero rate, how much it costs to access your Mobi site, etc. It's important that you actually are interested in work seeking and are looking for access to a job rather than how much you have for accessing data, etc. So we've been able to zero rate our site and make it free of cost to a young person. And it's much more important the interest and the ability that a young person demonstrates versus what a young person's qualifications are. So I very much resonate with what Mona has said in terms of the qualifications of the skills. It's about what you actually bring to the table, and can we reduce the barriers to entry to a young person to be able to actually access an entry-level job.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So I know we're talking about zero rating. I just want to point out, sure, we've lost you a couple of times as you were talking, and I think we still got the gist. You might at some point need to turn off your video just so we can continue to hear you. So, I just want to point out a couple of things that she was saying. So first off, for those who might not be familiar, what happens in a number of economies is because you're paying for internet access by the byte. If you're downloading video, you're trying to be trained, or you're trying to have access to a community, that the cost can be extremely high, especially for those of low incomes. And so working with a local carrier so that they zero rate it, that is, they don't charge for that access while somebody is using your app, is a huge gain, because it means that there's no penalty, that your learners and your community can continue to have access. So, but also, I've also heard from what Sharma was saying is removing barriers. Is we often think of these as being almost mundane things in developed economies and in dense urban centers. It's not that hard to get from point A to point B if you've got good public transportation, or you've got family members nearby that can do childcare. And if you don't have those things, you have massive barriers potentially keeping you from being able to work at all. And so, so we talked about a number of these sort of on the ground problems to solve. Also want to make sure we're helping people to sort of step back and look at the interconnecting tissue that needs to be there. So Michael, I'd love it if you just describe this, especially with Skills Future. One of the things that's just breathtaking about the way that you've and your agency has approached this is to have a systems approach. You have you're systems thinkers, and you've essentially looked at all those different pieces at the macro level and how they need to be connected. So can you just give that, and there's some unique characteristics of Singapore, including its size and the trajectory of the growth of its economy, that I think have made it particularly capable of doing this. But help people understand what that connective tissue is, and especially when you think of the connections between industry and the education systems, how that needs to be hacked to be more effective for more people.
Yeah, certainly, Gary. And you know, I'll just pick off from a point that Mona talked about earlier about knitting the different pieces together. And that's what we really need to do when we think about education and training and jobs as a system as a whole. And that's how we have approached it, take an ecosystem point of view to it. And I'll talk about it in sort of three different parts, right? At the very front end, at the upstream of that system, we need to be able to anticipate what are the skills that will be in demand. And that has to be tied to the economic strategy of the country or the city. Where are the growth areas? What are the new skills that are needed? We need some kind of forecasting on numbers and the types of skills. We also need some kind of forecasting or sensing of where the jobs are, what employers are looking for. And so having insights in those areas is critical as well. And we do that in a few different ways. We convene with different industry panels to develop skills frameworks, and we've developed 34 of them, mapping out the kinds of jobs, job families within different sectors, the jobs, the kind of technical and soft skills needed for each job. And that gives us a taxonomy to look at the kinds of skills training that's needed for different types of jobs. But beyond that, we also use data to our advantage. We scrape job boards to get a sense of the scale and the types of jobs that employers are looking for. And we scrape job boards not just from Singapore, but from global sources as well. That gives us a sense of where the shifts in industry trends might be. And so having that kind of data to inform us gives us some kind of sensing of where we need to go. And I'll move on to the second part, which is about making skills training accessible, reducing barriers, making it accessible. And that requires us to think about it as a system as well. Students coming out from our formal education system needs to be work ready by the time they graduate. Otherwise, they'll have a hard time getting jobs. How do we get that industry intelligence back into the educational system, the formal educational system, so that curriculum can be adjusted, learning experiences can be adjusted. And clearly in our workforce skills development systems, we also infuse that kind of market sensing intelligence through the system, and making that the training modular, bite-sized, fit for purpose, and working with different institutions, not just our traditional educational institutions, but also experimenting with different models, like with Generation. That bootcamp model is very interesting to us because we want to see how we can rapidly reskill individuals for very specific types of jobs that are in demand. And we also experiment with apprenticeship type models, work study programs, as we call them. And the third part is really making it affordable, because such education and training doesn't come cheap. And having the right type of skills training, especially for leading edge skills, could be quite costly. And so we provide funding support, and we take an inclusive approach to provide more support to disadvantaged groups like low-wage workers, the smaller medium enterprises, or persons with disabilities. And we partner with the private sector to provide what we hope will become universal access to a lifetime of education and training.
So Mo, you just hit a bunch of points about different parts of the ecosystem that I just want to call out to the participants. You talked about how industry needs to change the way that it talks about the skills that it needs. You talked about educational institutions need to think differently about how they train, how individuals need to think differently about the skills they develop. That's a whole bunch of change. That's a whole bunch of mindset shift. So how do you do that? I mean, how do you, especially at the macro level, where you've got entire industries and often traditional educational institutions, and is there some magic wand or secret sauce that helps you to be able to encourage that kind of change?
That is the most difficult part of it, right? That mindset change, the motivation to change must be the most difficult part in any organization, in any system. So it's a work in progress. We're hoping to shift mindset of individuals to have a sense of agency, to see themselves as lifelong learners, so that it's not employers pushing them or the government sending messages out, but they want to learn on their own. And there's a lot of awareness building. We run festivals, we run events, we highlight success stories, we build up a set of case studies. But even beyond individuals is also the employers. How do they value skills and hire based on skills and not just qualifications? How do they continue to invest in employees, even though they might leave and go to the competitors, right? So taking a much more enlightened mindset to this. And it's constant work in progress. And I think it requires sustained efforts over time. And we see momentum build up bit by bit by bit. And interestingly, COVID actually helped us a lot. The recognition of the need to quickly pivot the businesses, embrace digitalization to survive the COVID crisis due to the restrictions on businesses, that actually helps us a lot in terms of the shifting mindset. But it is an arduous piece of work that requires sustained effort.
Yeah, certainly one of the things I talk about is so many people have protested that change is hard. And, we all had to adapt very rapidly to this Zoom world. And so we proved that we can. However, I often, when I lecture, I show a picture of a person in New Zealand on a bungee cord. We as humans tend to sort of bungee cord back to the ways that we used to do things. And I think that's one of our challenges and our opportunities now as we start. You've proven you can change. You overnight adapted to learning how to be able to work and learn from remote. Now, how do we take those learnings and actually instantiate them so that they last? Now, Rashni, a lot of the discussion that we've been having is sort of at the systemic level, where the rubber meets the road is typically with specific populations. And I know that in countries like South Africa, you've got a huge youth population. And they're often the people that we most want to make sure that we're ensuring are going to have access to work, but it's also the population that is some of the greatest challenges in doing that. So how do you think about that from a systemic standpoint? And then from a programmatic standpoint, how do you ensure that you're trying to put the kinds of initiatives in place that could help the most youth to be able to be connected to meaningful, well-paid work?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I believe that government will always play a critical role in creating an enabling environment for this type of activity, right? So obviously, and like I said, one of the key things that we do as DTI is obviously we develop policy and strategies to be able to achieve certain economic objectives. And so from a government perspective, we obviously had to look at, and specifically, so I'm obviously a little bit different in terms of what Generation or Harambee would do in terms of actually providing the skilling and creating the pipeline to feed into the available jobs, or the demand is what we call it. I'm obviously on the government end, where I think the focus around GVS was primarily to bring new opportunities, employment opportunities into South Africa. So the priority started off as being, jobs. Let's just get jobs into South Africa. And that was through servicing, obviously, offshore clients. But what happened was, as we started back in 2006 and 2007, we had an incentive program that encouraged, cost competitiveness and encouraged some of those jobs into the country. But at that stage, we didn't get the kind of impact we were looking for. We also had a support around, a training support grant, to support the jobs that came in, but it was all around the company specific sort of requirements, as opposed to, making sure that these were actually the right people for the job. And that's when we started to see that, listen, there's certain things which, doesn't necessarily work. And, as national governments promoting, innovative solutions to economic challenges is of the utmost importance. South Africa has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Currently, we're sitting at about 32.6%. And as a result, a key priority for government is being able to create job opportunities for these unemployed people. And with the GBS sector, which, like I mentioned earlier on, includes, voice type of BPO activity, which is what they call business process outsourcing, was seen as a key enabler for job creation, predominantly for youth. And as such, it was defined as a priority sector within government. But as a priority sector, government could not do everything on our own. And as a result, we had to collaborate with industry. We had to develop, a proper strategy to be able to support the growth of the sector and achieve, the key objectives. And as part of this journey, there were important lessons that was learned, such as the absolute necessity in matching skills development initiatives with demand. Historically, huge efforts and financial resources were invested in skills development initiatives. However, they were mostly misaligned to the job requirements and resulted in poor performance outcomes. As the South African value proposition for global business services is centered around quality, and that is bringing the right skills into the workplace, was critical. So as government, we could not achieve this on our own. Therefore, through a partnership with the National Industry Association, BIPESA, representing the employers, and Harambee, who was very key in representing the skills supply, we were able to develop, smart and effective training solutions at scale, and that would be able to match the demand. So for me, I think, it was through, government working through partnerships and collaboration that we were able to find, the winning formula for job creation and demand-led skilling. Thanks.
No, that's marvelous, Rashni. So Sharmi, that clearly points to you. So help us understand a little bit about the way that process worked, and especially how you helped to encourage the agency among young people. But then also, I think one of the threads running through this, and I know Mona has mentioned this before, is the mindset shift. How do you help an employer to look at that, especially that young person, in a different way? Later on, I'm going to be interviewing Byron O'Geist, who runs Opportunity at Work, and he talks about skilled through alternative routes, STARS. How you have to, but there's a mindset shift by that employer that this isn't the traditional person I would have brought into this job. How do you help to break down that barrier and to do that at scale?
Thanks, Gary. I mean, so firstly, everything you've said and also what Rashni said, and I'm a big fan of Byron's work with Opportunity at Work and STARS, etc. I think for us, it's about demonstrating that there's a value for young people who don't demonstrate the technical qualifications necessarily. So whether it's you have a college degree or qualifications that seem to be required of the role, but the actual competencies that are required of the role. And I think for us, it's both advocacy with the employer to say, what is the actual job? If it is a cashier, or if it is a shop floor manager, or a retail job, or sales, etc., what are the real skills that are required of the job? It isn't most times it isn't a college degree, it isn't the qualifications, it is actually the competencies. And most of the time what we've realized is it's not demonstrated through the GPA or the qualifications, but the actual qualifications, the competencies that are required of the job. And it requires incredible advocacy on intermediaries' part, like Generation and Harambee, etc., to advocate for the young person, but really importantly with the employer as well, to say, break down what is really required at the entry level for a young person to get into an entry-level job. And on the flip side, for a young person to say, what have I done? And in South Africa in particular, over the past week, we've seen, riots and people being really in many ways, the riots of the past week, you've seen this in the global headlines. They've been the tip of the iceberg because people haven't been able to demonstrate to the labor market that young people are capable of a lot, but the labor market does not really recognize what they are currently doing, whether it's volunteer work or community service or a number of other things. And so we realize that skills that young people have aren't being translated into value into the labor market. And I think the work that you mentioned with Byron Auguste and STARS and Opportunity at Work really says, okay, how do you translate what a young person does on a day-to-day basis, whether it's taking care of a young person, taking care of their community, or volunteering, or hustling work, which increasingly is the norm for many of the young people on the African continent. How do you translate that into value in the labor market? And how do you get an employer to really recognize that as value? And importantly, break that down in a job description, because many job descriptions for entry-level jobs across the world, and particularly in the global South, requires many years of experience. And that isn't just feasible for a young person entering the labor market. So it's a question of labor market mismatch, but importantly, it's can we reshape and recalibrate the signals such that a young person entering the labor market can actually get the jobs that they are able to do very much capably and excel at them, instead of necessarily requiring years of experience that are usually required in the job descriptions that are put out in adverts on the job market. So we do a lot of labor market advocacy with both the employer, but importantly with the young person, saying that, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis? Young people are rarely idle, but it's important for us to say, how do you translate what you do on a day-to-day basis to the labor market in terms of signals that are valuable to an employer?
No, absolutely. My father in the book What Colors Your Parachute, he used to say job titles are poetic metaphors. The same job title, even the same job description is different, in so many different organizations. And often the hirer doesn't even understand the problems that need to be solved in the first place. And so helping the employer to just change that mindset and to actually focus specifically on the problems that need to be solved and the skills that can be used to solve them, skills that can be acquired through a range of different alternatives. Now, we've been talking a lot about young people, but Mona, I know you also recently did a study focused on mid-career. And so I wanted to just have you briefly help people understand a little bit about some of the barriers, but then some of the potential solutions that you've heard. And then our time is short today, but I want to wrap up. We've got some questions in the Q&A that I want to just throw out to all four of you and see if you've got some responses. So Mona, if you could briefly just tell us about that research and some of the takeaways, that'd be marvelous.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll also link it to some of what Sharmi just mentioned as well, about employer perspectives. So first and foremost, when you look at who are the long-term unemployed, in most countries, the vast majority are the age 45 plus. And when I say long-term unemployed, it means that you've been unemployed for 6 months or a year, based on the definition. So we then began exploring, well, why is that? And we've also begun trialing programs within Generation, where we've now served about 950 plus learners who are age 40 plus. And we have firsthand seen ageism on the side of employers, and it's deeply embedded, it's deeply pervasive. And one of the things we wanted to do in the research is to put a number on that. And so we did a survey across 7 countries, and I'll just share 2 of the findings and then talk about the implications. I mean, one is that when you look at hiring managers, and we interviewed thousands of them, essentially, they see the age 45 plus cohort as having no strengths relative to younger age brackets, right? literally they see 15% as being a good fit for their company culture or the role. Then when you ask them, well, what actually happens in those rare cases when you have hired someone who is age 45 plus into an entry level or intermediate role, how have they done on the job? Those same employers will say that 87% of those cases performed as well, if not better, than their younger peers. That's what bias looks like. All right.
No, I'd say here in Silicon Valley, I say all the time, I'm not only am I the oldest person in the room, but since I don't have enough college to stuff into a thimble, I could never have applied for any of the jobs of all the people in the room.
Exactly. So I realized that we're running short on time, but the point here is that it's above and beyond advocacy, which is an important part of it. But there has to be evidence of performance, of what actually occurs when you put someone who is age 45 plus or a youth without a college degree or whatever it is, because the reality is that there are biases against every single cohort, but they just look different. And putting a name on it is the first step of trying to fix it. But it requires evidence of what actually happens, and it requires diligence of that study. And so I would love to talk more, but I know we're short on time, but that's at least some of what we're tackling. And one of the reasons we were so excited to work in Singapore is we're also serving the age 40 plus population there as well.
No, absolutely, because I think, I mean, this is the opportunity and the challenge is that there are so many different populations. And again, the pandemic has made it clear just how it always, these major resets always illuminate that those who are the least advantaged are the ones that become even more
Absolutely.
disadvantaged. Yeah, I do. Here in the United States, we solve the long-term unemployed issue very easily. Once you've been looking for 6 months, we call you discouraged from looking, and we just take you off the statistics. So that's an easy way to solve that problem. So really briefly, then I would just want to, we've a couple of questions in the Q&A. Ed Lindsay is asking about, he's always interested in basically platforms for self-employed tradespeople. This is one area, Ed, that unfortunately in this session we won't be able to get into as much, but basically this is one of the I believe the near-term opportunities in many countries around the world is we need to aggregate basically human capacity. So different trades, people in different industries and different arenas to be able to make up for what is, at least in the United States, a trend line away from collective action and collective voice, but also to see those as training platforms. And so in the United States, we've got groups like the Freelancers Union and others. But I think increasingly the work platforms like the Upwork of the world will be some of the opportunity to be able to gain some of that, not only collective access to work, but collective learning and collective voice. But the questions I want to throw out to each of you then, Anna is asking 3 questions. What are some upskilled resources that you might recommend? So I would call these, training, hopefully rapid training. She mentions Coursera, but are there any other platforms that each of you think of when you think of learning online? Do you think that certification programs are a better choice if you don't have a skill? Like basically we think of these as credentials or stackable credentials here in the United States, and then employers would consider you without the skills that you have, but if you have a certification. So any of you want to take any of those? What are you platforms for upskilling, certification programs, and do you think employers would consider certification programs in different markets? Michael, looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, Gary, if I could jump in. I want to talk about the certification. I think that's critical because if we think about the issues we're talking about, whether is it for youth or is it for mature workers, we need employers to recognize the competencies and skills that they have so that they are able to get jobs after investing in skills development. So having a system that allows for that recognition, I think, is critical. In the Singapore context, for a number of jobs and professions, we've established skill standards, and we actually do the credentialing as well. We actually issue skills certificates that is recognized by employers. And some of those skills certificates then go into a career ladder. And in particular lower wage jobs, there's actually a progressive wage model where employers have to follow that model. If the employees get the skills, they would have to pay them more as they move up the ladder. So I think that recognition by employers is very important. On the part of individuals, I think the ability to demonstrate the value of skills acquisition through job placements, I think that's important. And also building the confidence that they can learn, whether it's especially for the mature workers, a mature population, because many of us would not think of learning as a go-to, and we need to build up that confidence. And so provision of some kind of individual learning accounts, like the Skills Future credit system that we have here, helps to build that confidence. So I just want to add those two comments.
No, I just want to make sure people are clear. What you've done in Singapore, Canada just recently announced a similar program. Is essentially it's an account, it's money to pay for training, especially for older workers that want to continually keep their skills relevant. And this is something from a policy level that I think many countries should encourage. But also, what Michael you're pointing out is, we've got this mentality around. Vint Cerf and I were actually talking about it in the track overview for the future of work. But basically, we've got this sort of mentality that in the past, learning was these things around degrees. And even though I don't want my brain surgeon to have just been trained on a YouTube video and walk into the operating theater, there's tons of learning that can be done, what I call just in time and just in context. And so the whole idea of these credentials and certificates and things that can add up to a set of capacities is increasingly the way we're going to need to codify learning. We're going to have to structure learning so that people can actually prove to, it's all about risk reduction. How do you help that hirer to believe that you are not a risk to hire, that actually you can solve the problems that they need solved, if, as Charmy and I were talking about, if they actually do understand the problems that need to be solved in the job. Any other thoughts that you, Mona, you had your...
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick fact on certification. So in the survey, we asked employers, what would you value in order to consider an alternative profile than what you would traditionally? And so on certification, about 75% of employers said that having an industry recognized certification would significantly raise someone's profile and make them take that individual much more seriously than if they didn't. And so, and that, obviously coupled with robust training that is profession specific, that, by the way, matters much more than government subsidization of wages. So that was yet another insight. So certification matters.
Yeah. Charmy, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that certification matters. I think for us, we did a survey last year that, so there's a lot of hype about the future is digital, but what does digital mean? We did a survey last year in South Africa that broke down what digital skills mean and what specific skills and job families are required or are in demand. And it isn't sufficient that you get certified and skilled up in sort of really random digital skills, but there were specific skills that were much more in demand than many others. So it was Amazon Web Services, cloud computing, junior desktop technician, back office support. And I do think that certification in demand skills matters so much more. And I do think that young people entering the labor market do need to be coached and informed about those in-demand skills. And I do think that that's important for us to actually bridge the gap between demand and supply, such that it's not just get demand sort of digital skills or coding, etc., if you don't have a sense of what actually is required in the market. So the only caveat I'd make is that what is in demand, getting young people to actually get certified in those skills that are in demand in the market would be important.
Oh, I appreciate it. So, okay, we have 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask you each for the lightning round, one tweet and an answer. I give you a magic wand to wave. You can change one thing about the systems that you're focusing on to try to encourage people to be able to learn and have access to the meaningful, well-paid work. You've got one magic wand, one tweet to describe it. Michael, I'm going to pick on you first.
Well, I just wish that everyone would see themselves as a lifelong learner. Then they will find their own solutions and solve the problems for themselves.
Wonderful. Perfect tweet. Mona, you're next.
That anyone who is funding workforce programs pays as much attention to the outcomes on employment and income as they do on the volume trade.
Charmy.
I would hope that skilling has to be short, sharp, and very cheap, but learning is lifelong. So let learning be lifelong, but skilling has to be cheap and short and to the point, and getting young people into jobs as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. Rashni, take us home.
Yeah, from my side, I'll definitely say that I'd encourage socially responsible sourcing, and that is to access inclusively, what we call excluded youth into the system of employment. So I would definitely appeal to people to be more socially responsible when they're sourcing, because you definitely get a better return on your investment in those individuals. Thanks.
Wonderful. Listen, thanks to you all. For those whose questions we couldn't answer, I've got your questions. I'll answer them in a later session. It's so wonderful to see each of you. I wish we could talk for hours on this topic, but thank you all for your time, your perspective, and your insights. Be well.
Thank you.